Pune has a population of over 60 lakhs. A very, very small percentage of that population, of course, is here. We have a few hundred people here. For Vicharwale, that does not mean that those who did not come are Vicharwale. But still, I feel that this idea of this Think Festival, of the Vicharwale Festival, has to be made more popular. Pune has a tradition of making popular events. Lokmanya Tilak started the Ganesh Festival, the public Ganesh Festival, and it became so popular. It was started with the intention of popularizing nationalism, patriotic feelings, and it became very, very successful and is still going on. I think Vicharwale should be a festival like that to popularize thought, popularize Vichar, and I really wish that this festival will grow into a very forbidding force in the future. Many a times we talk about launching, floating. We are talking about floating companies. My friend Sahid Mirza and me, actually, we floated friendship. We literally floated friendship because we met about 15 years ago on a boat, a catamaran from Bombay to Goa. And it was a very rough sea. Most of the passengers were vomiting, and this is where we floated our friendship, which has lasted for the last 15 years. Sahid has been a good friend, a good mentor. He has seen me as a young artist doing my watercolors. He has encouraged me throughout, and he has seen the whole growth of my work, not only my work, but he has been a great kind of an uncle to my daughter and my son. He has always encouraged all their endeavors. I'm really glad that I know somebody like Sahid Mirza. Most great people have some kind of a mystery, some kind of a wonderful anecdote connected with their birth. Krishna's, when he was born, was taken the flooded river. So all these interesting anecdotes are connected with great people. There is also a very interesting and a very strange anecdote with the birth of Sahid Mirza. He was born in 1943 in Mumbai, and he was delivered, his mother was delivered by a doctor called Dr. Patrao. When this great doctor delivered the baby, and when he was holding this baby in his hand, he did not realize that this baby, Sahid, is going to marry his own daughter. Sahid Mirza married the daughter of the doctor he delivered him. And we are very proud that this girl, his wife was a great friend of mine, Jennifer Mirza. Jennifer has some connection with Goa. And now Sahid has his second home in Goa, or first home in Goa, so he lives in Bombay and Goa. So we are very, very, very glad that such a person lives in Goa. He definitely gives an intellectual touch to the wonderful air of Goa. Sahid started briefly his career in advertising. Then he came to Pune and joined the Film and Television Institute. He has been a student there, then he became a teacher there, and today he is the chairman of the Film and Television Institute of Pune, of India. He shot into fame basically because in this world of Bollywood, he was a different voice. He did not go along with the normal Bollywood masala. He is the doyen, he's the father of parallel cinema in India. Salim Langde pe mat rona, Albert Pinto ko gussa kyun aata hai, Mohan Joshi Hajir ho, and many others. And then after the Babri Masjid was demolished, Naseem are some of the great movies he has created, for which he has been awarded with the Filmfare Critic Award, with the National Awards, and many other awards. He has been lecturing in India and in many universities of Europe and America, basically in connection with films. When I was in the college, having a television set at home was worthwhile, basically because of the news and some of the serials which he created, like Nukkad, we grew up on Nukkad. Nukkad was a great serial, and also Intizar was a great serial, and actually it was worthwhile having a television set basically because of Saeed Mirza. Saeed has created many, many documentaries. Now, his next documentary is going to be called India, Ye Hai Meri Jaan. He has traveled for many, many months. He's one of the most well-traveled Indians. I think very few people know India like Saeed Mirza. Just a few months ago, he traveled for 3.5 months non-stop. From Bombay, went up to Rajasthan, Gujarat, Rajasthan, went to Kashmir, Uttaranchal, Himachal, Bihar, and came back through Madhya Pradesh to Bombay again. This was a long, long trip where he went with a set of actors. There were 31 people on board, and he has created this documentary which will have, I think, 21 episodes, which will be launched soon. He's going to Delhi tomorrow for a press conference to launch this on behalf of Doordarshan. It's fiction with facts. It's a totally new kind of a documentary. Saeed was supposed to come to Pune. He was supposed to drive from Pune, but last minute he's told us because he has to fly because he has been traveling so much on the road. He knows India on the back of his hand, but that has also given him a backache because of too much of car travel, and that's why he had to come by flight. Saeed is somebody who is an internationalist, a humanist. He is born in a Muslim family. His wife is a Christian. His one son is married to a Chinese. Another son is married to a Lebanese. He has written a book, a few books, and now he's working on a new book, which is about a dialogue between three people who lived in different centuries. Aryabhat, living in 5th century, Brahmagupt, living in 7th century, and El-Biruni, living in the 11th century. They were astronomers and polymaths, and there's a dialogue between these three. It's a drama he's going to write soon. And what is interesting is I always found that he has traversed the borders of religion, of caste, creed, nationalism, but when he writes this book, he's also traversing the borders of centuries. I have loved his other book, which is called Ami, Letters to a Democratic Mother, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. You must read this. This is a kind of autobiographical. Well, I'm very, very glad that I know Mr. Mirza. I get to spend time with him, learn from him, and I'm very, very sure that all of you will also realize that it is wonderful to listen to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now request Syed Mirza sir to take over.
Friends, I would like to thank all the organizers behind the Pune Biennale who invited me over here, and I'm honored to be here. Last night, Amita Deshmukh invited me to her office for a dinner, and I met a lot of young people who were volunteers for this Biennale and the work behind the scenes. I had an opportunity to meet some of them, and I was amazed by their enthusiasm and their spirit of giving and trying to make the Pune Biennale a success. I know this is the inaugural session, and I really wish it great success in the future. And I once again thank all the organizers for inviting me here to speak today. Before I get on to my paper, I would like to read a little excerpt from my book. It's called Ammi, A Letter to a Democratic Mother. And it lays the kind of framework on which I can take off and read my paper. So I thought of it this morning and I asked Subodh if he had a copy of the book, and he did. So I have it here with me, and it's a short excerpt that I want to read out to you, which will give you an idea of what I'm getting at. This is a little chapter called An All-Male Tale. You'll have to forgive some of the language over here because it was recorded, but it's exactly how it happened. There was a funny conversation I had with a group of young male entrepreneurs I met at a party in Mumbai in February 2006. Among them were two exporters, a budding builder, an investment banker, a stockbroker, and a restaurateur. We were discussing the plus points of Indian democracy, the phenomenal growth of the economy, and how it was changing the face of the country. But everyone agreed that much more had to be done, and a lot of obstacles to this growth had to be removed. At one point in the conversation, I posed a question to them. What is the percentage of people benefiting from our growth rate? They looked at each other and a figure was arrived at. We think it's about 50%. Are you sure? Maybe about 40%. Isn't that high? There was a pause, and then a figure was finally agreed upon. Some are benefiting and some less, but not less than 30%. What is the percentage that you think is benefiting more, I asked. They looked at each other and after a little debate arrived at a consensus. Oh, it's about 10%. Don't forget that's 100 million people. What about the other 20%? They're benefiting a little more slowly. And they will have to wait. What about the other 750 million people of India? They will have to wait too. For how long? Look, Mr. Mirza, said the restaurateur, how do we know? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, who knows? Our bloody population negates all progress. Every year we produce more people than the population of Australia. Then the stockbroker got into the act. How can we create jobs for all these people? Now it is the turn of the builder. We should all stop fucking for 20 years and then the problem will be solved. Everyone laughed as the builder looked around to see if he had been overheard by any of the women in the party. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a state of affairs. It's a fact. This is the truth, and this is my country. I have to proceed a little further with a little more excerpts before I get onto my paper. Beyond the hoopla, beyond the grandstanding, beyond the high fives, we have to understand what our nation is really all about. The population of India is over 1 billion, and the people involved in the feast of this dramatic growth are about a third of the total. This is consensus, approximate agreement. It was the same 60 years ago. It is the same today. The numbers have only trebled, that's all, because of the population. There has been no change in percentages. Today, there are 9 million young people who graduate from college every year, and most of them have dreams about jobs and a future, and yet only a quarter is absorbed into the regular workforce. The rest have to make do with anything that comes their way, and so many of them remain jobless. Across the country, many millions more finish school, and unable or unwilling to study further are on the lookout for work, any work. What nobody really notices is that the biggest employers are not the blue chip corporations that have fueled this so-called growth, but security companies that provide the personnel for factories, homes, and the thousands of cooperative societies in rich neighborhoods across the cities of India. Providing security as a business is the biggest single employer of all, beyond the railways. The biggest single employer. Those who get jobs are the lucky ones. What do the rest do? For a nation that has more than 50% of its population below the age of 25, the numbers are terrifying. Every single year, on passing out from schools and colleges, these young people will relentlessly appear looking for jobs and for work. They have all seen the good life on television and in cinema, and all of them want to be a part of it. And most of them are also in a terrible hurry. Is the country prepared for them? If it is not, try to imagine the social upheavals that can follow. These are the excerpts from my book, written in 2007. I will not get down to my paper. But if you realize the paper now is an extension, it comes from here and then moves on further into another realm of thinking. It's called the lumpenization of aesthetics. This is my paper. I would like to inform you that I'm not an academic. I'm a filmmaker, writer, traveler, and hopefully a thinker. The views I'm going to present today are not the observations of a trained sociologist or analyst, but rather that of a concerned Indian who has spent his life dealing with the affairs of people very often on a face-to-face level, and that is the truth. Having said this, let me move on with my paper. It is strange that I use the word lumpen and link it to aesthetics. Lumpen and aesthetics. What does it mean? This is because the word lumpen is categorically associated with a social existence, and this paper of mine widens its scope to the aesthetics of existence. Let me begin with the word lumpen. For those of you who are unaware of its origins, it was a German word used to describe that section of society that in its very nature was considered parasitic and lived a life that was antithetical to what a nation would call productive labor. In rapidly industrializing 19th century Europe, it would include beggars, thieves, street gangs, louts, the jobless, prostitutes, etc. In other words, Europe coined the word to include those sections of society, dregs as they would call them, that it perceived were a threat to good governance. Good governance, of course, meant good for those in power, for the emerging robber barons, for the emerging industrialists, for the emerging merchant bankers. If it was good for them, it was good governance, always. Thank you. Over the next century and a half, Europe and the rest of the world would move away from this easy categorization of a large section of the population as sociologists, social anthropologists, and philosophers recognized that the so-called dregs of society were a product of a distorted and iniquitous economic and political system. And yet the word lumpen exists today. I would like to believe it reflects a state of mind. And today it extends far beyond its social boundaries to include large sections of the urban, middle, and upper middle class in India. And what is the state of mind? It basically means dealing with yourself, and the only priorities are with your personal existence. In other words, self-absorbed. As far as the mindset of the rich and the super rich in my country are concerned, it doesn't matter because they will get their way any which way. Our economic and political system has genuflected before them in the most humiliating manner. What interests me is the mind of the middle and upper middle class. This, ever since our independence, was the fulcrum of our society. It was the linchpin. This was the class that actually inspired our independence movement, both in thought and deed. And having achieved it, retired back to its professional existence. This was the class that had a sense of continuity and sobriety, with neither the despair and anger of the poor and dispossessed, and nor was it terribly enamored by the profligacy and excesses of the emerging ruling oligarchy. It had a work ethic. It had strong links to the past and a firm faith in the future. And by and large, it was ethical. It's about us. It's about us. All of us. Over the last 40 years or so, I've seen a steady erosion of these very same qualities. And this erosion was dramatically increased when the country opened up to the idea of liberalization and economic reforms. This middle class never anticipated what was to follow. We would get insurance and financial conglomerates, retail, clothing and footwear conglomerates, automobile conglomerates, conglomerates for toiletries, facial creams, deodorants and perfumes, mining and petroleum conglomerates, communication, food and beverage conglomerates, entertainment, and even arms conglomerates. And behind these momentous changes, behind these changes, were middlemen and women who were very strategically placed next to the corridors of power and in those places where economic and political decisions were being taken. The country was on sale. In urban centers, the most visible manifestation of the great euphoria of being finally free from the license Raj were magnificent malls, shopping arcades, lounge bars, multiplexes, nightclubs, boutiques, theme parks. They were springing up all over the country. And backing this hedonistic lifestyle was a blitzkrieg of film, press, and television commercials that celebrated the nation's coming of age. Editorials in leading newspapers heralded India's leap into modernity. Beauty contests became front-page news. Dozens of glossy magazines on fashion, food, fitness, and health, men's and women's grooming were launched. Mainstream cinema was not far behind in eulogizing this new state of affairs. India was the happening place. The streets of Mumbai or Delhi were supposedly just a heartbeat away from those of Paris, London, New York. What did large sections of the new middle and upper middle class do? Who were children and grandchildren of the earlier generations? What did they do in all of this? They got seduced. Seduction. It got seduced by all the goodies on display, foods, cars, clothes, electronic gadgets, toiletries, beverages, shoes, and everything else that was on display in these incredibly inviting store windows and shelves. It began to party. It was almost as if after years and years of abstinence, this solid block of sobriety had gone on a binge. The politicians, economists, and planners behind the economic reforms applauded. Wow, well done, they must have said. What nobody realized was that the center of the nation had caved in. Jal. A barrier that kept things in check had been breached. There was nothing to temper the onslaught of excess. In fact, this class relinquished its pivotal position and took on the same aspirations and ambitions and greed that symbolized the bourgeoisie. Launching the new aesthetics of the good life, aspiration and ambition were the corporate houses, both Indian and multinational, that made sure that the new approach to this dream lifestyle was dutifully disseminated through their own corporate advertising agencies. The other players to emerge from the shadows to further contribute to the new aesthetics were developers, builders, middlemen, wheeler dealers, stock market manipulators, money launderers, mining barons, political warlords with strong links to the corporate houses, and the underworld with strong links to the political warlords. This was the new star caste. And it was potent, incredibly potent. All of them are making fortunes in the newly introduced boom time, no holds barred economic system. Now try and imagine what kind of an aesthetic would this kind of group launch. Which brings me to the subject of my paper, the lumpenization of aesthetics. It is about the mindset and consciousness of about 35% of the population who have enthusiastically participated in a dream that is now today very slowly turning into a nightmare. Boom time is over, hard facts are coming in now. Post-2007 that I was reading my paper out to you. Now, the nightmare is creeping in, and what should happen? This was a class that was supposed to think, because by the very fact that they were educated and professionals, it was their duty to do so. Instead, most of them chose to be swayed by factors that were, for lack of a better word, regressive. Does my paper deal with the lifestyle? Yes, it does. But what is more important to me is that this lifestyle cannot be seen in a vacuum. It has to be seen within a context to fully understand its social, political, and economic impact. I would like to add that I have nothing against grand parties. I have nothing against the buying of expensive cars, and I've got nothing against having a good time. I have nothing against a tastefully decorated home. In fact, I have one. It's relatively modest, but it's nevertheless tastefully decorated. But I do have a problem with a blinkered existence that ignores and is far removed from the other yawning reality of India, the India of the dispossessed and the disenfranchised. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is about 60% of our population. Hell of a lot of people. A few examples would help to understand what I'm getting at. For some of you in the audience, these examples might sound uncomfortable, perhaps even more so than that, but I have to make my argument because I firmly believe that we as a nation have very little time to see what we have become. Let me also inform you that I have not come here to hurt anyone's sensibilities, but to open up a debate. I'm getting on an age, and if I do not speak my mind out now, when will I do so? Now let me recount a few examples. They reflect in some measure the arguments I'm driving at. Let us take the case of a very famous stockbroker. He died in the late 1990s, or early 2000s, I think, around that time. He died a few years ago, and may his soul rest in peace. But when he was alive, he was manipulating shares, banks, and ordinary investors and making a personal fortune that could run into thousands of crores of rupees. When he was finally arrested, it wasn't just the financial risk kids and other stock market brokers who thought he was a hero. Large sections of the middle class did too. I remember had gone to a premiere of a friend's film, and the biggest applause was reserved for him rather than the film stars who were present. Here was a man who had manipulated the stock market, was fundamentally a crook, and was being treated like a celebrity. It set me thinking, was this real? I can understand the mindset of stockbrokers. Their job is to make money any which way, and that's a fact, no matter what they say. They were applauding a man who had almost succeeded in getting away with a financial crime of immense proportions. What about the middle class? What was their mindset? Were they also applauding the crook? Let me give you some other examples. Let us take our festivals in major cities, whether it is Diwali, Eid, Durga Puja, Navratri, Christmas, or Ganesh Chaturthi, and ask ourselves which are the pandals that are the glitziest, play the loudest music, and have the largest throngs of devotees. They are the ones sponsored by the new leaders of our new aesthetics. Corporate houses, developers, political warlords, and the underworld. Everyone knows it. And yet there's this incredible silence. Is it because no one gives a damn so long as a good time is had? Is it because we choose to look the other way? The main sponsor of the Indian cricket team is a corporate house, known for its dubious past and also its dubious assets. Our cricket team, our pride, our joy, our faith, our hope for the whatever. Now this corporate house has also been slapped with the Supreme Court order to pay a 25,000 crore fine, and yet no one cares. The cricket team, built up by the media into demigod status, has a logo of the corporate house emblazoned across their shirts. On the helmets is the logo of the cricket board, and above that, the flag of the Indian Republic. Does anyone see the irony of it all? I do. A wedding party thrown by a tycoon that costs us $10 million. A mansion built by another that costs 10 times more becomes news. And we lap it up. We lap it up knowing that over 60% of our fellow citizens live on less than $2 a day. We see young children, boys and girls, sometimes 6 or 7 years old, singing and dancing item songs from popular films as their middle-class parents in the television studios proudly watch their wards. The television audience watching such programs across the nation watches wide-eyed too. Have we ever asked as to what do we want for our children? What was the driving need to do this? I can go on and on about the relentless onslaught on our sensibility that occurs every single day in our newspapers, television screens, and cinema theaters, but I have to reach elsewhere. I have to reach elsewhere. I have to try to understand what this unbridled consumerism, euphemistically called liberalism, has led to at the social and political level. Strangely enough, rather than expanding, I believe it has blinkered and ghettoized large sections of the middle class and upper middle class minds. Can you see the irony of it all? Rather than expanding, it's ghettoized. The questioning, probing process that underpins our humanity has been replaced with a narrowness of vision that is so self-centered that nothing else seems to matter. And this narrowness of vision can be seen in political movements. I had mentioned in my paper before social upheavals that might occur. Watch them happening now. When I read from my book, as the process of liberalization goes deeper and wider, caste-based, religion-based, sons of the soil-based, linguistic and ethnicity-based movements are on the rampage across the land. in Maharashtra, UP, Bihar, Karnataka, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and all of the Northeast. Or any one of us asking us why they are happening? Are these movements really what they claim they are, or are they grim economic realities that are hidden behind those populist slogans? Some of these movements have even led to great massacres in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Assam. And the tragedy of it all is their leaders have been eulogized by large sections of the middle class. Large sections of thinking professional people whose fundamental duty was to question that's their historic duty and their right, and they didn't. What has become of us? When did we lose our sense of justice, and which is not just for us, but for all? When did we turn inwards and exclusive? When did we turn lumpen? As the euphoria of economic reforms, as a solution to all the problems of the country begins to fade, other forces have stepped in to add to the maelstrom of movements. An overlooked, feudal and regressive mindset that has been dormant for years has suddenly reared its head and lashed out against the clash of cultures. Right-wing Hindu fanatic groups, right-wing Muslim fundamentalists, even Sikh and Christian groups have railed against the materialistic and obscene values that have been imported from the West. Does all this have a link with aesthetics? I believe it does. Because the way people think and live determines their attitudes to their families, their communities, their cities, their country, and then the world. It also determines what they create as artists. As our politics turns divisive and disruptive, as political warlords backed by the underworld unleash their stormtroopers onto the streets, as corporate think tanks plan out fresh strategies to manipulate the people in power, as advertising commercials continue to eulogize the good life, as films and television shows continue to tell us fairy tales, take a close look at our towns and cities across the country. What do we see? I can go on to describe to you the incredible lawlessness of construction and the helpless and inadequate infrastructure that stares me in the face. I could also tell you about the callousness that greets ordinary citizens when they enter overworked and under-equipped public hospitals, the courts, and the police stations. I could talk to you about the garbage disposal, sewage, traffic, and transport problems. I could tell you about the brutalized existence of large sections of citizens whose living conditions are nothing less than shameful. I could go on. But I will not, because I know you know the answer. You know it. All of you know it. And that's a fact. This is what the common citizen has to deal with every single day of his or her life. This is his or her aesthetic. And if you are among the poor, the aesthetics get that much worse. The irony of it all is that a citizen has only to lift his eyes up a little from the streets of mayhem below to see the thousands of hoardings and billboards that still sell another world altogether. Those hoardings against the sky and the reality on the streets below is what my paper is really all about. I believe it's about time that we as the middle class reach out and see what is happening around us. We can still participate in the lifestyle that we choose for ourselves, but this time with a caveat. Let us use our common sense to see things not for their price, but for their value. Let us also remember that we are where we are, not because of our astuteness, but because we were given an opportunity. Let us also reach out to others because we have been self-absorbed for too long. And by reaching out, we can re-engage with the society to which we belong and also regain our humanity. I know we have lost faith in the judicial and political process. I know we are anxious about the future. I also know that only about 20% of emerging graduates find jobs. I also know that we are concerned about the rising cost of food, homes, healthcare, and education. I know we are concerned about all that. Now we must ask ourselves another question. If we are anxious about all these things, what are the poor anxious about? Think about it. There's another question too that must be asked. Who is responsible for this state of affairs? Is it you? Is it the poor? Or just a lying economic system that has taken the people for a ride? And the reason why I say this, why don't we ask the people of Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Italy about this question? They were also sold the same dream. As I conclude, I must tell you a short story. One political warlord found a solution to the problems of living in an unlivable city. He found the solution. He and his cohorts built another city. The question to be asked are, how many other fairy tale cities will be built? Is this what we call progress? I now come to the other word of my paper, lumpenization. What do I mean? Since I have coined the word myself, I would like to believe it means euphoric and compassionless at one end and brutalized on the other. And the title of my paper is, in a sense, The Aesthetics of Existence in India. Thank you. Is there any question that
that has been the tradition always in India. The scale may look more blown up because of the media. The numbers may look larger because there are larger numbers. But almost every issue you mentioned was as intensive, as conflicting 50 years back.
True? I said that. I said that. I said that.
Then why are we trying to link it up with, no, I am not support of liberalization, globalization, or that it is, there is a large number of population which is poor, which is not being touched by process of development. It was never being touched by process of development. Either in license Raj, before license Raj, any time. So why are we linking it up to something recently happening? For instance, Marathwada riots.
Right.
Happened in 70s when so-called socialism was constitutionally declared as the objective. We have a history of caste riots. We have a history of religious riots. We have a history of barbarism. And we have a history of Indian middle class just neglecting everything. Thank you.
I agree. In fact, what I said was the percentage is the same. The percentage is the same. What happened 60 years ago, the same. So I am not going into the fact that the past was better than the present. It isn't that. But globalization, I believe, this particular economic impact of it has, look at the difference in terms of thinking. That's all I'm getting at, the nature of thinking of a process, which globalization, I believe, has sort of stunted to a very large extent. The idea of questioning or debate, that's all I'm trying to say. And we've participated in that. I am not making a case for the past and the middle class being there for no. Percentages are the same as you said, 60 years ago. So there's no panacea for change, or this is not going to change the economic conditions of the poor. 60% have always been left behind, perhaps 70%. Yes, I agree with you. It was not my intention with that. It is to be able to see that there's a dehumanizing process that has occurred far more rapidly today, across the board, and a brutalization much more rapid. And actually, I think what's happened today is the shortening of memory. And I think it's very deliberate. Thou shalt not think, or you should only think for the moment of an event till the next event occurs. Memory, our sense of history, that has been telescoped and foreshortened. And that to me is the incredible tragedy. And today, I think we're in the age of loss of memory. Like you mentioned, Marathwada Raj, who knows about it? You know it, I know it. You know about all the... This is the tragedy of our times, foreshortening of memory. This is a time of almost no memory. Or memory that the famous Nazim Hikmat, the Turkish poet. This is how long does grief last? In the 20th century, for at most a month. Then I added on, and in the 21st century, for perhaps a day, or just about enough time for the television cameras to record it, and then it's over. I agree with you. I completely agree with you.
Can something be said about grand solution to this?
And this light is hurting my eyes. I've just had a cataract operation. But no, I can't see you.
Yeah, here. Yeah, here.
There is no grand solution, but there are questions that I can ask, which again come from my, unfortunately, I'll have to quote from my book, but it's an idea. It's not an answer. There's no grand answer. But it's an idea that can perhaps, I believe, open up to further questions. Let me read out a small paragraph. Where are we today? And I've tried to understand it. And how we are following on a path laid out of globalization. Is the path to the future that the world has now chosen the only one that is good for mankind, which is globalization? And is this path irreversible? It's a question that I've asked for myself to answer, and I don't have an answer, but I think the question is very important that you've raised. That is this path that we've chosen for change and for development and upliftment of society, is this the only path that is valid? And therefore, if it's valid, is this irreversible? Because there are no answers that are being given to by this path. Then I go on to a certain kind of question leads to a certain kind of answer, and then a corresponding question. Did anybody question the question? Because when you ask a question, if you've taken a stand that liberalization and globalization is the only solution, answer, all right. So there might be four, so let's improve upon it. So the question is, the thesis is globalization is good. So all questions have to follow from there. All right. I am saying the questions are perhaps wrong. The questions that we ask for us to get an answer. If I say, As an example, I have a revolver in my hand. It is manufactured, made in the earlier times, and I put a bullet into it, and if I shot with that revolver, I could injure or kill one human being. All right. So somebody comes up a little later and says, only one? I can give you 6 bullets. So now you can kill or injure 6 people. Because the question that was posed was, I have 1 bullet and I can say, how many more? 6. And if you follow the logical connection, you'll end up with the nuclear bomb. The point is, what was the question that led to the first revolver? What was the question? And that has not been questioned. And logically, you will follow into a tunneled vision, and you'll ask questions, will give you other answers, which will lead to mass destruction. This is an answer, an example that I'm giving you. But we have accepted that this is the only way. And then, if we choose this as the only way, the next section would be very simple. This is the philosophy of the continuous race. This is our globalization. This is the philosophy of the continuous race, the endless marathon that the rest of the world has now adopted to try and catch up, and where to stop running spells doom. It's a tragic situation, and we don't seem to have an answer. But the state of affairs is such, which is true, we have no choice but to keep on running, to be at the same spot. Is this wisdom?
I think that is correct, because few years back I was in Bhutan and it was a completely isolated country from globalization, and they were much happier than today.
I'm not so sure whether I'm against development, but my question, what is development? If we have to ask this question, of course I'm for progress and development. But the point is, what is development? I think we have to ask those questions. If development means more cars in the streets, I don't know. Is that an answer? We have to start again. And I'm not suggesting regression. Please don't mistake what I'm heading towards. I'm not suggesting regression at all. All I do know is that we are not in confrontation with nature. We have to be part of it. And that's critical. It's so important to be part and develop from that line of progress and that line of questioning. I think we will be better off as human beings.
Let me take this problem further.
Yes, sir.
The idea rather which you are rather saying it has some sort of a relevance to the industrial society, which is highly competitive, market-oriented, profit-centric, and definitely has created a competitive spirit for the exploitation and some sort of a self-satisfaction, or you may call it earning personal property or something like that. Very few can participate in it successfully. Many of them,
by its very nature, it is restrictive.
it is restrictive because the whole system is exploitative. Whole system is exploitative. Whole system is class creative. And definitely the top class benefits at the cost of the lower classes. This is happening during all this industrial revolution which is going on for the last 200 years.
Yes, sir.
Now I'm coming to the globalization. Globalization of the 21st century is of a different nature. That's what I visualize it. Different nature because different forces have come in. Different processes have come in. Altogether, different goals or different ways of satisfaction have come in. For example, definitely the open resource movement has come in.
Right.
Well, people have created Wikipedia. Everybody can freely access it. YouTube is there. So many other websites are there which give you freely things. Ask a question and many will answer. There is some sort of a urge to help others or give best whatever you have to others. This is not the selfishness type of a approach. It is some sort of a sharing approach, a value, because they are sure that on the global networks, somebody will benefit. A different sharing comes in. Consider the networking or social networking. A problem arises and thousands are. Now I'm coming down to the point. Whole point is, if rather these new processes are coming up which are socially dependent on each other, create some sort of a value system. In what way future could be visualized and how this Olympianization process or might be barbaric type of other approaches, could it have some sort of a soothing effect on all these things? I mean, that is my question.
You know, as you were talking, I smiled to myself. You know, the social media, and when you mentioned Wikipedia, it always gave us an idea of saying, perhaps we are not as impotent as we feel we are vis-a-vis change. When the social media came in, we felt we could have a voice, that we felt that we could participate, we felt that maybe we could change things around. But look what happened. Look at the controls coming in. Look what happened to Julian Assange. Look what happened to a man who was saying, for God's sake, this is what's happening around your world. He has been silenced, and the world media is silenced about him. Exactly what you are saying is a social media that could be used to reach out to ordinary citizens and say, you have to be free of thought. You've got to be, your thoughts cannot be controlled. But look what happened to the man. He had to finally hide in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And those medias, the control that's coming in, what will be left, sir, I think, open to our so-called free information is ideas that sell products. That's all. Not thoughts and ideas by themselves, for the sake of being thoughts and ideas. There'll be a clamp down. They know the potential of it. And the example of Julian Assange is right there in our face, staring us in the face. He tried. He's a good man who was questioning. He was questioning the world he lived in. Look what they did to him. Silenced. Not a word, anything on the papers of so-called free world and free press. Where is any information on Julian Assange, except if you go on the internet? None. None whatsoever. Where is the coverage of a man, say, like Noam Chomsky? Where is the coverage of a man like, say, P. Sainath and the work that he's doing about questioning the processes in India? Where is it covered? There's a conspiracy of silence. And I think fundamentally what they're saying is what I'm trying to get at over here simultaneously, because they are questioning the brutalization of the human being and our minds.
Yeah. I mean, just to extend this, what I thought is, because electronic footprints are being left everywhere, okay, I believe more of such Julius Assange-like incidents will happen in the future, okay. He may have been silenced, but the trend is, it is very difficult to, keep the water bubble down the sea level, the bottom of the sea. Several bubbles keep on coming because, it leaves electronic footprint. You can do nothing about it. Like, for example, you do a dubious transaction, banking transaction in, say, 2007 sometime, okay? It might hurt you even in 2025. You never know, because it leaves a footprint, okay? Now, I have another question. My question is, the popular press is talking about a word known as demographic dividend, okay? And I would like to call it a demographic curse, okay? The reason is simple arithmetic, okay? The arithmetic is as follows. In the last 80 years, from 1930 till today, the United States from the Great Depression built a great country, so-called, in terms of prosperity as it is defined today, in terms of infrastructure. They did this with 1/5 of India's manpower, okay? If you really see the population of United States, they did it with 1/5 of manpower. And they also did it when the technology was not all that great, okay? It was like an elementary level of technology in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. The point which I am trying to drive at is India with 5 times as much of population of the US, and with the latest technology where the bridges can be built or infrastructure can be built at a very fast rate. What do you think the people will have any useful vocation or useful work for, the 80% of people? Because the US did it with 1/5 of the population with 80 years old technology, and they built the country which is 9 times geographic area as India. India has 1/9 of geography as United States and 5 times the population of India. That makes it 1:45 kind of a, odds to fight with, okay? So if you have 80% of people who have nothing to do, okay, I believe unless some kind of maybe useless or otherwise, some kind of activity is generated, okay, people will have nothing to do. For example, you got to have beauty parlors. Somebody would like to have, say, big parties so that some caterers would get employment. You have this Sahara kind of stadium so that some construction workers will get employment. You have to do something about it. Otherwise, 80% of people will have no work to do. See, I am not justifying any kind of corruption or anything, but the problem is so grave that what will these 80% of people do?
Actually, I don't know. But I'll tell you the answer actually. Because it has stemmed from a certain kind of development. You have to logically end when 90% should not be working at all, put them all jobless. This is the thought process that's occurred. When did the first robot come in? And why was it there? It was there to maximize profit, as simple as that, and lay off workers who think. It is so simple. Don't speak, don't think. Kaam karo. Charles Chaplin, Modern Times, is the prime example of that. So logically you extend an argument and it will end up there. When 90% of people are just laid off and they don't matter. And they will be called lumpen then, dregs of society of the 19th century Europe. Layabouts, jobless, prostitutes, beggars, thieves. Because you asked those questions. And your developmental process were based on those questions. You had the arrogance to confront nature, you think you can tame nature, and therefore you're following entire process of thought. And question and answer stems from that tunnel vision of the world. It is not expansive. It's here. That's all. And you'll end up like this. You're right. I don't have an answer to that. But I'm saying let's bring back poetry to our souls. Poetry. In thinking. And stop being mathematics and economists and bring back poetry. Bring back compassion. And another form of development takes place. And don't think you're lords of nature, you're part of nature. Something else is going to happen. That's why, is this path irreversible? I don't know the answer. It seems irreversible. It seems irreversible to me. But, you're right. 50 years from now, I don't know. It's going to get terrible. They're working towards eliminating the human, I don't know, it's...
Yeah, I'm seeing driverless cars being promoted by Google.
And the drones start to bomb, now it'll be driverless planes. Aircraft carriers, no. Point is, you've arrived at it with the drones. Philosophically, you've arrived at it. And the drone is the most compassionless weapon of instrument. All weapons of destruction are compassionless. And this is a prime example. Unseen, unheard, dumb, lasered destruction. That's science, that's technology. But it comes from a mindset. It comes from a mindset of thinking. And that mindset we have to question. I agree with you. We have to, and I don't know. So when Julian Assange asks these questions, when Sainath asks these questions, when Noam Chomsky is asking these questions, and Medha Patkar is asking these questions, they're all asking the same, they're concerned.
See,
how do we see the next 50 years? 100 years. And as Ashish mentioned yesterday, it's impossible for every country to become the United States of America. It's impossible. There'll be no earth left. There'll be nothing left. It is built on the fact of keeping others out.
Another, aspect that I would like to highlight is, most people, this is my guess, I'm not too sure, they aren't thinkers necessarily. The society at large has to take care of people who are activity driven. They are not thinkers. They want activity. You get up in the morning, you got to do something, right? You have to spend day till the night, till he sleeps, okay? It is not necessarily thinking, but he needs to move, he needs to do something, not necessarily deep thinking or anything, but he needs to spend his time till he again falls asleep.
The man who invented the drone would probably say, give every human being a chewing gum, let him chew, and that's activity. And he'll think of that. Their minds function on these principles. It's called progress. Are we done?